Okay, guys, this is my personal history of the PUA, Pick Up Artistry movement, and really the literature of that from like an ideological perspective, because I've read quite a few of these memoirs and books, and I've seen some of these podcasts and things, and I found the literature to be by far the most compelling and interesting, and I really dislike the podcasting scene because it's just filled with blather, and in fact, a lot of the literature is people rehashing stuff from their podcasts or vice versa. So I'm going to take, again, it's kind of a personal direction. I'm going to take this in as chronological in order as I can, but it's going to be from the perspective of how I experienced the literature, and so you should keep that in mind. I'm going to try to be kind of as free-flowing as possible here. Part of that is because I have the books with me, and there's a lot of them, and so you're just going to bear with me when you'll see me constantly leaning over here to pick up a book to show you, and that's just because they're literally on the floor behind me. There's no other way to do this. So just bear with me, and we'll dive right into this. I hate the bullshit in this community and the literature, and so I just want to kind of cut through that and give you like a primer on how these guys think, because like I said, I think it is ultimately highly ideological, and I want to convey that as best I can. So with that said, the first introduction I had to any of this was from, of course, Neil Strauss, the author of The Game. And so I have sort of the three books that he wrote. He wrote like a trilogy on the pickup artistry community. He was a kind of rock and roll gonzo type journalist for Rolling Stone, and he wrote a series of which these are them. So the first is the classic The Game, follow up to that, Rules of the Game, and then this book, Truth, about where things had gone for him after his experience. So The Game, of course, really is set everything up and is still quite funny and witty, and Strauss is a clever journalist, and he has a lot of interesting things to say about sort of the basics of the community and his work with mystery and the mystery method and blah, yada, yada, yada. So what he does, though, is he shows that within this community there is so much conflict, and perhaps not surprisingly, because they're obsessed with interpersonal dynamics. The most so although he sort of sets up this like Project Hollywood thing, and it's again very gonzo, right? They go out and they're sarging every night, and then eventually they're living together in this huge house in L.A. and it's all about trying to take this as far as they can. There's like a maximalist aspect to this. How many women can they get? How crazy can their methods get, and the techniques and so on. So anyway, that's an absolute classic, and he goes into, I'm just going to mention it now because I don't have any of his books because they don't exist anymore, really, which is Owen, Cook, Tyler Durden. So he talks, this guy, these guys all have pen names, so of course Neil Strauss is Style, and I can't even remember Mystery's real name, but Tyler Durden is this guy Owen Cook, and of course he's using this name from Fight Club from Chuck Palahniuk. So again, the literature reference is very important here. This is something Strauss talks about in some of his interviews that I've seen, which are, again, fascinating, but he says this very clearly. Like, he got a lot of his ideas from reading stuff like Joseph Campbell. You see what I'm going to say? I'm going to be sitting up and stand down an awful lot. Like Joseph Campbell, right, who wrote The Power of Myth, and he, did the Hero of a Thousand Faces, which is basically Star Wars. And so, like, they were getting into this, literary element kind of right from the beginning. They really had no choice because they were trying to invent this stuff, and where else would you go? So the guy who was really behind this, I'll get back to Tyler Durden in a second, but the guy who was really behind this, of course, was Mystery. And I have the two books that are sort of, the key here, Mystery Method with, was it Chris Oldham? And then The Pickup Artist, which is like the sequel to that. He obviously thought he could do a lot better, and that the style had made so much money and got them so popular with the Game series, so they try to cash in. A lot of this is about money. Let's face it, right? They're selling you a product, and the product they're selling you is their podcast series, their boot camps, and the literature itself, which sometimes is not cheap. Anyway, so these two, again, kind of classics of the genre. This shows you how ultimately how shallow these people are, because what Mystery is talking about is, where did they get this information from, and where they got it. A lot of his techniques from was, obviously he's a magician, so he got them from magic, illusion, hypnosis. It's like kind of hilarious, like Arrested Development. Kind of, was it Job Bluth, sort of stuff. Like, so it's funny. It's also so simple. But anyway, at that time, the point of this is they were creating this literature from the beginning. A lot of it came from the internet. Not surprisingly, they're on these forums. There's like this goes on and on and on. I don't know talk about too much because it's so tedious. But there's like these red pill forums and the Pick Up Artistry communities, So Suave, blah blah blah. Today you can read a lot of this shit on the I think it's PUA archive or Red Pill archive or something. Anyway, or you'd have to go back and look at the internet Wayback Machine or something to get to the bottom of this. And there's too much of it, frankly, to do that. And the people who have looked at it so extensively have kind of gone crazy, which is funny too. But anyway, so to get back to the basics, so they were using this literature and creating their own literature as they went along. And Strauss was by far the best at this at the beginning because he had a background in journalism and he was interviewing these people and he was living with them and it was embedded with them, and it has this gonzo, when he's like hanging out with Courtney Love and there's all crazy stuff, drama everywhere, and Tyler Durden is trying to kick them out of the clique that they're in. It's just so ridiculous. But anyway, what they become very obsessed about is social dynamics, and so they're like fetishizing these social psychology, social dynamics, and trying to exploit that as what they call a technology, even it's not beyond technique, but they're trying to exploit these what they believe are these kind of fundamental social dynamics, and they're getting that information from all kinds of sources. So this is why I mentioned right at the beginning mystery, because one of his sources, this is according to Nick Krauser, we'll talk about him in a minute, but where they're getting their sources from, in this case, is like dog training manuals, is where it's coming from. But also, a lot of it is coming from, and this is very clear because they say this again and again and again, is coming from basically 2 or 3 really critical areas, and those are the works of... Okay, so I got to go back. I got to step back. So one of the guys who's really influential on Strauss was this dude Ross Jeffreies, who was I think he wrote the book Speed Seduction, so he was a speed seductionist. And this was sort of like late 80s, early 90s when they were doing this. And Jeffreies was a neurolinguistic programmer guy. So he was getting his information from the neurolinguistic programming community, which is Richard Bandler, okay? And so this is the famous Richard Bandler, the book you want to know about what they think about how this works. This is his book, Frogs into Princes, and it's like a 1970s cult lecture that they did at some community. It's kind of how it reads, but and then of course he's done other stuff on it, Guide to Transformation, all yada yada yada. And what these people are ultimately is they're kind of a combination. They're critics of the psychotherapy movement in a way that the founder of L. Ron Hubbard is sort of like this too, like the founder of Scientology. But they're critics of the social psychology movement and and the psychotherapy movement in particular. And they are getting their information really from B.F. Skinner. They're Skinnerites in the behavioral psychology literature. So I'd have to talk about you see how quickly this is going to get complicated. I have to go back to talk about Skinner. But it's more than just one. Again, the point here is this is a pastiche. Okay, it's coming. All this, their idea, their ideology, is reflected in the literature, is coming from all over the place. So, Skinner is a famous behavioral psychologist, but he started off. I just have some of his books here. These are like a great lecture series he did. Science and Human Behavior, and there are others. But he was a famous behavioral psychologist. He started off as an English teacher, I think. He was so he was interested in literature, funnily enough, and language, which is what the neurolinguistic programming guys are all about, and then how that's reflected in behavior. Okay, and also Jung, and one of the books they like a lot is I have Jung's. This is part of his official collection, The Psychology Types. This is where the NTP, was it Miggs psychology test? I can't, Briggs-Myers. Yeah, the Briggs-Myers test, right? That's where they come from, is from Jung. And then they like this Robert Moore Douglas Gillette, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover. This is like a synopsis of Jung, kind of shortened down, which a lot of this, believe me, because if you actually start reading this stuff, it becomes, frankly, I'm going to tell you this straight up, the PUAs are so fucking shallow that once you get into actually reading, Freud and Skinner and James and Maslow and Rogers. The actual psychology of it is much more interesting than the really shallow version you're getting from these people. But so they were hugely influenced by Jung, Joseph Campbell, and the monomyth that Strauss was so influenced by is really just a variation on Jung's the collective archetype. The archetype's the collective unconscious, right? So it's the same kind of regurgitated Jungian principle coming back again and again. And so anyway, so like I said, so you've got this combination of Jung, Campbell mythos, Richard Bandler, neurolinguistic programming, which is like, again, the best way I can explain that is it's like a combination of hypnosis and body language analysis is sort of what it is. So they're really notable for, like, when you're looking in a certain direction that tells you something about what a person is thinking. And so again, you're supposed to be paying super close attention to all of this. And if you've ever followed these, kind of like body language analysts, you can just see it gets so over the top and ridiculous because they fetishize this, obviously, because they're looking for these hidden cues and indicators of interest and all this stuff. And so somebody like Mystery and Strauss, again, when they were creating this literature, took this big, huge pastiche of stuff and just kind of like cobbled it together. The thing that gets added to that very frequently is, I'll talk about a specific book in a second here, but a series of books, because they had a lot of this you can just pull out of Strauss, ultimately. Like, I got this from, you get this information from just reading their books, and they in a lot of cases, they don't hide their sources. They're telling you where they're getting their information from. And a lot of it's media and movies and things, but then it's also the literature. And so, there's a few more people I want to talk about just right at the beginning to emphasize that point, of which this one comes up all the time, and I have to say it because I find him unbelievably shallow, but it's Robert Greene. So if you've ever read this Robert Greene stuff, and they love two of his books in particular, but he wrote a bunch. So the 48 Laws of Power is kind of the famous one. And this, again, is like it's decontextualized historical anecdotes brought to you by Robert Greene, and like, what does Robert Greene think about power and Machiavellianism and dark psychology and so on. And then he wrote a series of, he wrote one specifically that they reference all the time, which is a book on seduction. Perhaps no surprise. And he regurgitates the same things because his sources are always the same. But he also wrote a book on war. This is like Zap Brannigan's big book of war, Mastery, Robert Greene, Master, and then the Laws of Human Nature, which if you want, this is like the bleakest, dark triad, dark psychology stuff I've ever read. Anyway, so I have to bring him up at the beginning because they always cite him, and so did Strauss. And what Robert Greene does is, like I say, he's a decontextualizer. So he likes to take anecdotes, and they come from very specific, very clear sources that he's interested in for whatever reason. Machiavelli being one of them. Specifically, I forgot to bring it out here, but Machiavelli wrote a history of Florence, which is the key source for a lot of this. And they, but people will always talk, and of course the IR people and the political scientists, yada, yada, they will talk about the Prince and the discourse on Livy, and that's all fine and well. And there's another Strauss you should read, of course, not Neil Strauss, but Strauss from Chicago, the Straussians, because he was an expert in political philosophy. So anyway, so there's a political philosophical element to this that comes in as well. Anyway, and Robert Greene also gets his material from, the Book of Change, in Song Dynasty China, the early Warring States period stuff. They love that. And like I said, I think that what gives the game away for Greene is war. It's the fact that he wrote an entire book on strategies of war. This gives it away. And you can see it again in the literature because they talk about, and Strauss, right back to the basics, might even be in his index, but he talks about what they do is they go on boot camps and they go, sarging, verb, to pick up women, or go out and try to meet women. Noun, a woman who has been picked up. Sarger, person who picks up, sergeant, right? And then the way that, and then also from poker set and so on. So, but they get a lot of this from warfare, what they think warfare is about, and where their ideas of warfare come from is it comes from these Robert Greene decontextualized history. So these anecdotes, basically anecdotes, that Greene is telling you in the hope of what the publishers say is to educate you on power and Machiavellianism and so on. But the thing is, I don't think a lot of people read this stuff, but I actually have, and so For example, one of Greene's major sources is Baltasar Gracian, The Art of Worldly Wisdom, okay? Now, Baltasar, if you've ever read this, it's like the darkest, most Machiavellian shit you can fucking possibly imagine. So basically all he says is backstab everybody. It's like we're in like, Sterner, it's like beyond Nietzsche, we're in like Sternerism, you know, so it has like, there's like a connection with libertarianism and Ayn Rand that, you know, and like her distaste for Kant. I'm going to talk about Kant in a second. But so there's definitely like a individualist, libertarian, kind of military, quasi, you know, paramilitary like element to this. But ultimately what Robert Greene and Baltasar Gracian and the kind of stupid version of Machiavelli is just betray everybody and, you know, just backstab everyone, and you know, your words don't mean anything because it's all a strategy. Everything's a tactic, a game. You're trying to get to some end, and it's you can, you know, you can in this game of seduction you can manipulate anyone and to any extent with any of the techniques that you have. And you see this very clearly again in the Tyler Durden character, the Owen Cook character in Strauss, because he's portrayed as, and I think it does come across in his videos. He's famous for this video series, The Blueprint, which is really quite stupid. I'm afraid to say there's a funny part in it where somebody in the audience asks him about, an older gentleman, and presumably asks him about, this is like a 4-hour-long like weekend boot camp. They're doing boot camp again, and where he asked this Owen Cook about Rubenesque. Like, do you like, you know, what about Rubenesque women? And Owen Cook's such an idiot, he doesn't know what Rubenesque means, so he's like, what? You know, can you explain? Anyway, so these people, so you have these really shallow types, and but they have convinced you based on their selective reading from this corpus of literature that they have a secret key to the game, and they're in this secret society, and they're make you feel like an insider because it's militarized, and so you're part of the squad, the boot camp, you know, you're sergeant, etc. Anyway, this goes on, and they, you know, they have the method itself always have very elaborate. They've again, like Mystery does this. Many people said this, but it doesn't really get much better than this because it's so perfectly systematized. That Mystery was a lot of these people are kind of like autistic systematizers, and so what they really want to do is impose a system on, and this is where the behavioralism comes in, is Pavlovian, right? They want to impose a system on these, like Clockwork Orange, on a biological, what is, you know, could be described as, but it's a sociobiological incident, which is the, you know, social dynamics. And so they're looking for systems to facilitate that. Another guy that they like to cite is Eric Berne. This one's a no-brainer. It's even in the title. Eric Berne, The Games People Play. This is the social transaction. The transactional analysis is what he calls it. And he has a sequel to that, which is what do you say after you say hello. These are all about conversational tactics, and like they're very straightforward. Oh, the other guy who does this, who's really good at this, is I'm going to have to look this up, so I will talk about this while I'm doing it, as I can't remember his name, but he wrote the Jeffreies Factors, Thinking Tempo, these books. This goes back to the militarization thing, which is super relevant because this guy specifically says where he got this from, which is when he was working for the U.S. Air Force as a consultant. I'm just going to look this up. His name was Venkatesh Rao. And so he wrote this long blog post called The Jeffreies Factor, which is an analysis of The Office, the American version of The Office. I'm assuming from the Rishi Gervais, the UK version, but it's an analysis of The Office. And he talks about how there's these different power levels going on in the discourse, and they're engaging with each other at these different levels. And you can see that most of the top guys are all these like psychopath, sociopath, dark triad guys. What a surprise! And that they have a particular language and like, you know, speech patterns and that they use to talk down to the plebeian underlings who, you know, the proletarians who work for them, the idiots, what he calls them, the losers or something, right? Anyway, he says in his book Tempo, which is just about, again, it's about conversational analysis, which goes back to Eric Berne. Eric Berne did really do this, and he has, you'll see these diagrams that he does, and funnily enough, they look an awful lot like some of the shit Mystery talks about. You know, so what Berne is saying though is this is really straightforward. There's basically 3 levels. You child, adult, and like how they interact. I said 3 levels, but I mean really I just remember those 2. Yeah, and so you're like, oh yeah, parent, right? That was it, parent. So that makes sense. So parent, child, adult, and the main thing he says that I remember from the book is information exchange takes place at the adult to adult level, and then if there's any imbalance in that, like if it's an adult talking down to a child or a parent talking down to an adult or something, then you have these disimbalances, and that causes friction. You know, whatever. Friction, of course, is a term from Clausewitz. So there's another military, concept for you. Again, oh man, so much of this, and so I will. I'll mention briefly, because again, I'm saying going through this sort of how I'm thinking about it. This guy, Jack Donovan, is another tool who does this, and this bleeds over into and they call it this, the manosphere, and, they dress it up with these terms, but this bleeds into that way of men, the way of men, Jack Donovan. I don't know if you've ever seen this guy, but he wears like a shirt that has like chicken bone lapels in it. And so there's really kind of beyond the pale, if you will. But there's many, many, many of these series, again, because he's selling you something, which is this book series, Becoming a Barbarian, Be a Bigger Alpha, blah, 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 blah. And what this is, civilization is overrated, is the thing on the back, right? Return to barbarism. So you see here, there's an important connection between the Evo-Psych community and what these guys think the world was like in the Stone Age, because they've sort of fetishized that, because I think it explains a lot, it justifies a lot of their ideology. They think it does. So anyway, I'll go into that in a minute. I want to go back to another one of these core sources for Strauss. So we're getting through it now, and this of course is absolutely fascinating, but I highly suggest you check out. It's cited by him again and again and again, Nancy Friday's literature, because they couldn't figure out how women thought, so they needed to get the inside perspective. Nancy Friday wrote a bunch of books about that. There you go. So the famous one is My Secret Garden. This was a revolutionary when it came out, because it scared the hell out of people, because in the female psychology literature, of which, here we go, Mary Wells Walsh, Psychology of Women, Ongoing Debates. This is real psychology of women, not the bullshit these guys are going to teach you. But anyway, in that, it's very, in the formal literature, it's obviously very clinical, and not by any means like this erotic. It's based on the Freudian tradition, so it's again very clinical psychoanalysis. So it's not the titillating eroticism that these guys wanted. So they went to Nancy Friday, and so like I said, Nancy Friday wrote a bunch of books about this. And when they came out, they scandalized people. She wrote one about men. She wrote a bunch about women. She's very interested in this, and these are all about the same thing, which is women's sexual fantasies. And it turns, according to Nancy Friday, it's almost too horrifying to speak of, but according to Nancy Friday, perhaps not surprisingly, women are very obsessed about, and you'll see this in modern iterations of this, but they're very obsessed about domination and submissiveness, and this fits back into this confidence thing, the confidence game. These guys are con men, right? So they're selling you a confidence game. And a lot of it has to do with sales, and that goes to my point about it being ideological. So again, what I'm talking about here, though, is just the sources these guys are drawing on. And this is right at the beginning, and they're more innocuous ones. So for example, they all like Casanova. I don't know how many of them have actually read Casanova, because he's really just as you may not be surprised, he's like kind of a rogue, but he's really just like an 18th century gentleman, and they're all sort of similar Barry Lyndon, Macbeth Thackeray-esque rakes, right? The seductionists. Cited, of course, by Robert Greene, who also read this stuff. But so, yeah, they're selling you the sources. So some of them are innocuous, some of them are not so innocuous. Some of them, it's, again, this pastiche of, psychology and critics of psychology and counter-psychology and, Evo-Psych. Evo-Psych is a huge one. I was going to talk about that a little bit later, but I'm kind of overwhelming it, so I might as well wait a second on that, because that comes up. It parallels in a way what's actually happening in the psychology field, which is the rise of evolutionary psychology. But yeah, so those are your kind of core. I think I got them all. Oh, there's one other, because it actually comes up in Mystery. He doesn't talk about it in the first book, but he does talk about it in the Pick Up Artist. He specifically uses this term, and it's in Strauss, because he says his second book, The Rules of the Game, which this book is so funny, because it's if you follow my guide, you too can be living in a mansion in LA with a bunch of other people in Pick Up Artists and Courtney Love will be there, blah, blah, blah. But what he does in the Style Life Challenge, ultimately, it's quite funny, I'll just summarize this for you, is over 30 days, he organizes a dinner party. Okay, is what he does. He goes out and he invites a bunch of people to his dinner party. That's what you're supposed to do, So like it's sort of is overblown and like it's become. But how could it not be? This was like look at the binding on these books, right? Like I think this is pleather, but like it's like the Bible, right? Like it's almost sacrilegious the way it's dressed up. Same thing with The Truth. So like these became so popular. They were such, I'm sure it says like, New York Times bestseller, right? They were so popular that how could this not happen? How could you not want to get more information on this and become style mog people with Tyler Durden, yada, yada, yada. Okay, but one of the things that they mention, and you should know about this because I did not know about this, and it really is, again, it kind of goes to the Nancy Friday thing. In a way, it's quite horrifying. So again, not like I said, I recommend reading Nancy Friday. These people, if you're out there doing this research, you might as well go read it, right? Do it, come to your own conclusions, folks. Isn't that the idea? But okay, so very influential on these guys was the series The Rules by Ellen Fain and Sherry Schneider. And the reason I mentioned, like I said, because it's here. It's not just the game. I mean, it fits with their like lexicon for this is the game, but it's the rules of the game. Now, so this is kind of a male response to this series, which originally came out. I'll tell you, the Ellie Fain Schneider series, 1995. So, but it really it has an earlier, almost like Candace Bushnell, late 80s, framework to it. I'm using language now, but anyway, they have this series. Okay, they wrote a whole bunch of books, and again, just cashed in on this. They just wrote a whole bunch. This is only a sample of how much of this there is. The new rules for online dating, not your mother's rules, new secrets of dating, the rules 2. The rules, time-tested secrets to capture the heart of Mr. Right. Anyway, and what this all boils down to is it's play hard to get. It's the hard to get method. And so they say you must think of yourself as a creature like no another. You're this so unique and the center of everything, and you're such an egotist, of course. And but what they're ultimately, what it boils down to is just play hard to get. So Mystery specifically uses the phrase creature, you're interacting with a creature not like any other, and he got that from The Rules, absolutely 100%. That's where that comes from. So and I will note, he never tells you this. I had to find these myself. No Strauss, no Mystery, none of these people ever told me about this kind of stuff, and I had to look it up. I had to find it myself. So the research, you got to do the research, right? And like the point I'm making here is, it's not actually. This is why I'm doing this video for you. It's not actually in their interest to level with you, to actually tell you what's going on, where the research came from, what the background is, because it's too complicated for them. It doesn't fit with the simple sale, this like obsessive compulsive selling fetishization they have, which is this market thing, sexual market value. Everything's a market. It's a big economy. You're in this like global economy marketplace, blah blah blah. And you got to be out there hustling, got to hustle all the time, right? If you're like Andrew Tate or Dan Bilzerian or something, you got to be selling a hustle, and conning people all the time, like Trump, Anyway, so you can see that these are all like ideological beliefs, but where they're coming from is the important thing here. There's a clear background to this, and it is very, very successful and popular and read by a lot of people, men and women. So you should understand that. Like a classic is, and there's just so many of these, I don't have them all, and I couldn't even go through them if I did, because there's so many, but like Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, this is another classic of that genre. They all talk about this, right? John Gray. So look, they're so different, men and women are so different, they have different biologies, and they think differently, and this is going to go into the, which Eric Berne would disagree with, I'm sure, because, Eric Berne, oh man, I should talk about, not Nancy Friday, but in a different voice. Now, because that one, I think, was specifically mentioned by Strauss. Carol Gilligan, I don't have it here on me, but she's great. She wrote this little book called In a Different Voice, where she just analyzed some Freudian psychoanalysts who had done some research on kids, and they came to this kind of interesting conclusion about there being differences between little girls and little boys. No surprise. But they she took it in a really unique position by indicating that there was a deficit in the psychology movement itself with regard to the psychology of women. And as I point out, in Mary Roth, this book, Psychology of Women, there is, there's something to this. At least in the psychology field, they were beginning, the feminist movement, women, this was in 1987, women were, and men, psychologists were starting to think about this. And like maybe they'd missed something, right? What were they missing in the psychology movement? Psychology is a very fragmented discipline. So there's, just, you really want to learn something about this, go read like a history of psychology textbook, which I have a few of those. Anyway, so you can see, there's a good example, there's a good broad spectrum on where this information is coming from. I think I kind of covered it all. I mean, like I said, we can go into more detail about the psychology specifically involved. But I mean, really, it would just be kind of, superfluous. Like, have you read basic writings of Sigmund Freud? Have you read what Freud has to say about sexual, sex differences and like the pathology of sexual fetishization? Like, that's pretty relevant here. Or like, gee, all of this takes place in these social interactions. Maybe it has something to do with like Talcott Parsons, the structure of social interaction. Maybe you should look at that. Now you'll start noticing these books are all quite long and they're complicated, and these people people who are out there trying to get laid don't have patience for this or care or want to read them. They want the quick fix, the short answers, so they go for the mystery method, which is nice and short, or like again the Strauss, which is nice and salacious and filled with drama. Okay, so we're getting somewhere with this now. Okay, now so those are like the OG, right? And they have this huge broad background in there, but then it starts getting more people start to come into this. Obviously, it's hugely popularized by Strauss. I'm going to say it's like 2005 or something, maybe even earlier. 2005. Okay, nailed it. Yeah, 2005 by Strauss. So kind of kicks this off, and then with the internet, it gets bigger and it blows up, right? And Pick Up Artistry becomes this huge thing, and you got the David D'Angelos and like I said, the Ross Jeffreies out there, and the Tyler Durgens, and everybody's selling you their variation. Like they all have dumb names, and like I said, they all have fake pen names. They all got from literature. Okay, but so there's a bunch of other sources that start coming out of this that are related. So in the OG, from the internet era, because it starts turning into, not everybody can be a Niall Strauss. Not everybody can be Mystery. Mystery gets his own TV show, right? This is what the Pickup Artist is about, because his own TV show. So he becomes, again, like super popular reality TV shows, and but not everybody can be, like I was going to say, Andrew Tate, for example, was on The Bachelor, right? But so not everybody can be on The Bachelor. Not everybody can do it. So the internet people started to conglomerate on this, latch onto this. And a lot of them were a lot of these guys were like ex-business people or lawyers and of that kind of background. And they were like, they're on a hustle already, and they didn't really like their hustle because, of course, what they're doing is very shallow, not terribly interesting. And they think that they're educated, deep thinkers, yada, yada, yada. And so they need to justify that to themselves. And how they do that was go on the internet and write these long field reports, which is like an after-action report, like when you're doing a battle and you're bombing somebody, you have an after-action report. You can see, again, where so much of this comes from the military. What they think the army is like, what they think the military is like. But anyway, so the OG of this, and there's a bunch, but the OG was this guy, Pook. So they got the Book of Pook. There's a third one, it's somewhere else. But anyway, and Pook he's like a lawyer from somewhere, but he had like an arts background, and so he wants to make it a little, he wants to elevate it a little bit. Like, he's saying, what you need to do, you gotta be able to like operate on this deep level where you're tapping into, and again, this is so like Joseph Campbell, Jungian, you're tapping into these like archetypal, he calls it the mill, you're tapping into the deep background that the cavemen, knew about, whatever, and, or the founding fathers, he talks about them, like, hey, so you would, here's the thing. You would, if you were really interested in this thing in the Kantian sense, in a thing in and of itself, right, as the thing for itself, if you're interested in the constitutional history of the United States, you might go read a book about the constitutional history of the United States, or like, better yet, read the Federalist Papers, or like the letters of George Washington. These things exist. The biography of Hamilton, whatever you want, Jefferson, which you can do. I've got them back there. You can go read that shit. But they don't want that, really. They want to tell you, sort of prove their own superiority through their pickup artistry skills, because that's ultimately their proving ground in the battle sense. They have to go out, the soldiers, the warriors in the pickup game have to go out and fight. The pawns have to go fight, right? Because one of them wants to become the queen. This is an Andrew Tate thing. But so to do that, you have to have a battle, and the battle is there wherever their venue is, and it can, in this